Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Before we dive into tonight's creepy story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a scare. Now, let's get started. It was the Halloween of my senior year, my last Halloween at home before heading off to college. And honestly, I expected it to be like every other Halloween in our quiet little town. Nothing much ever happened here. Even a mild thunderstorm was big news for our neighborhood. The only real excitement came from the folks who'd go all out with decorations, and no one could top our next-door neighbors, Will and Jeanette Roberts. The Roberts had lived next door to us for as long as I could remember, and every year, they turned their front yard into a Halloween spectacle. They had everything: graves with fake, creepy epitaphs, life-size skeletons, cobwebs covering their porch, and terrifyingly realistic body bags scattered around the yard. It wasn't unusual to see people from neighboring towns driving by just to gawk at the setup. Will and Jeanette took a certain pride in their display, and this year, they'd really outdone themselves. They'd added a fog machine, red spotlights, and eerie sound effects that sent chills down my spine even in broad daylight. The whole setup was so intense this year that it almost felt real. But that was the whole point: freaking out the neighborhood kids and, if they were lucky, a few of the parents too. So, Halloween night was fast approaching, and with it, the crisp fall air and the smell of leaves on the ground. But there was another smell too, something I couldn't quite place. It was faint, almost like damp wood mixed with something sour. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just the smell of decay from the leaves piling up, and went about my day. That night, around 4 a.m., my dog, Rufus, started barking like mad. Rufus was a big, lumbering German shepherd who, for the most part, was calm and friendly. It took a lot to set him off, so when he started growling and barking at something outside, I knew it wasn't just a stray cat or a raccoon. Half awake, I got out of bed and looked out the window, trying to figure out what was spooking him. The street was dark and empty, and the Roberts decorations cast eerie shadows across the lawn. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but Rufus's fur was standing on end, and he kept growling, staring out into the night. I muttered for him to calm down, and he eventually did, but something about the stillness outside made my skin crawl. Finally, I got back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. When I woke up for school the next morning, the strange events of the night felt almost like a dream. I got dressed, grabbed my backpack, and headed downstairs for breakfast. My dad was in the kitchen, a frown etched across his face. "You know, if you're going to let Rufus out at night, the least you could do is clean up after him," he muttered, his tone edged with annoyance. Confused, I asked him what he meant, and he explained that there was a terrible smell out front, like Rufus had left a mess right in the middle of the yard. I told him I hadn't let Rufus out after midnight, but he just shook his head and told me to check it out myself. So, a bit annoyed, I went outside to take a look. I expected to find some sort of mess, but there was nothing there. No presents left by Rufus, no stray trash, nothing. But Dad was right about one thing: the smell was awful. It hung heavy in the air, almost making me gag, like something had died nearby. The strangest part was, there was no source, nothing visible that would explain the stench. I held my breath and went back inside, figuring maybe it was a skunk or some sort of animal that had passed through overnight. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination, and headed off to school. By the time I got home that afternoon, I'd almost forgotten about the smell. But as soon as I got out of the car, it hit me all over again. Only this time, it was stronger, almost unbearable. And this time, I wasn't the only one who noticed. The first wave of trick-or-treaters was already arriving, and some of the kids and their parents were wrinkling their noses, murmuring to each other about the horrible stink. Some even mentioned it was worse near the Roberts' yard, which got my attention. I glanced over at their house, and sure enough, I could see Will and Jeanette standing out front, looking bewildered. They were dressed up as usual, Will as a zombie, with makeup to make him look half dead, and Jeanette as a witch with a wild, dark wig and face paint. But they weren't focused on the costumes or the decorations. They were sniffing the air, clearly disturbed by the foul odor. As I walked over to see what was going on, I overheard Jeanette muttering something to Will. "I don't understand, we didn't put anything rotten out here." She looked genuinely confused, and a bit worried. When I finally approached them, I asked if they noticed the smell getting worse throughout the day. Will nodded, looking around the yard as though expecting to find the source any second. "Yeah, but I don't get it. We didn't add anything new to the setup, and we haven't put out any food or anything that would spoil." As we talked, I started to feel a weird sense of dread creeping in. I couldn't explain it, but the combination of the darkening sky, the thickening stench, and the eerie decorations gave me an awful sense that something was very wrong. That's when we noticed one of the body bags lying off to the side, near the hedges. It was strange because the bag didn't look like the others. For one, it was lying alone, not grouped with the other corpses, and there was something off about it. The material looked different, almost like it was a real, heavy-duty body bag, not the cheap, flimsy kind you'd buy at a Halloween store. Will looked at it, frowning, and muttered, "I don't remember putting that one there." Jeanette looked puzzled, but before she could say anything, Will crouched down and examined it more closely. The smell was strongest right there, almost suffocating, and he grimaced, pulling back. "I swear I didn't put this here," he said, glancing nervously at me and Jeanette. A chill ran down my spine, and I could tell Jeanette felt it too. Will's voice shook as he added, "I don't know what's in this thing, but something's not right." Jeanette tried to laugh it off, suggesting maybe it was a prank by some neighborhood kids. But even she didn't sound convinced. Finally, Will pulled out a small utility knife he always carried with him and hesitated, looking at us for approval. Jeanette nodded nervously, and so did I, though I wasn't sure I really wanted to see what was inside. As Will made the first cut, a wave of nausea hit me. The smell was overpowering now, almost like a physical force pressing down on us. He cut a little further, and that's when we saw it, an arm, pale and twisted, lying lifeless inside the bag. For a moment, none of us could move. It felt like time had stopped, and the world around us had shrunk to that one horrific sight. Then Jeanette let out a scream, and everything snapped back into motion. Jeanette's scream seemed to snap us all back into the moment. My heart was pounding, and I was frozen, staring at the ghastly arm poking out from the bag. Will dropped the knife and stumbled back, his face pale as a ghost. "Call 911!" he choked out, barely able to find his voice. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly that it took a few tries to unlock the screen. Finally, I managed to dial. The operator answered in a calm, professional tone, but I could barely speak. Somehow, I got the words out, telling them there was a real body in the Roberts' front yard. The operator's voice shifted, and she promised someone would be there soon. I couldn't believe I was saying it out loud, and part of me half expected this to be some insane prank. But one look at Will's face told me this was very real. The minutes that followed felt endless. Word spread fast. Someone must have overheard Jeanette's scream or noticed our huddled, horrified expressions, because within minutes, a crowd started to gather. Kids, parents, teenagers, even the elderly couple from down the block were all craning their necks, murmuring, pointing. All around us, people whispered to each other in hushed voices, some in disbelief, others visibly shaken. As the police arrived, they tried to push the crowd back, but nobody wanted to leave. The small-town curiosity was stronger than any sense of decorum. Flashing blue and red lights bathed the Roberts decorations, making the fog and fake blood look even more grotesque. The irony of it all didn't escape me. Just hours earlier, these props had been a source of harmless fright. Now they were the backdrop to something nightmarish. 2 officers stepped forward, wearing gloves and masks, and carefully pulled open the rest of the bag. I couldn't bring myself to watch as they inspected the body, though I caught glimpses, a face half decomposed, dark hair, a hand curled stiffly near the chest. It was beyond surreal. Even standing just a few feet away, it didn't feel like it was actually happening. Another officer approached Will and Jeanette, taking their statements and trying to understand how the bag had ended up in their yard. They repeated the same thing. They didn't recognize it, had no idea how it got there, and had certainly never put it out as part of the display. The officer looked skeptical at first, but he seemed to realize that their shock was genuine. Meanwhile, my mind was spinning, trying to make sense of the whole thing. Who could have done this? And why here, in our quiet town, of all places? The scene was closed off, with yellow tape strung around the Roberts yard and police officers stationed to keep the gawkers at a distance. Despite the officers' best efforts, people kept creeping closer, straining to get a glimpse of the grisly sight. I even overheard some teenagers daring each other to cross the tape, as though it were just some dark Halloween attraction. Eventually, the medical examiner arrived, and the officers gently removed the body from the bag and placed it onto a stretcher. It was covered immediately, but even that simple act sent waves of dread through the crowd. There was something about watching a real body being carted off that made everything sink in. This was a human life, someone who had, for whatever reason, ended up discarded in a suburban yard among Halloween decorations. The police spent hours on the scene, combing through the yard and questioning everyone nearby. My parents were mortified, and my dad had to repeatedly assure the officers that our family had no idea about the bag until today. Will and Jeanette, usually the friendliest people on the block, seemed completely shut down, barely saying a word. Jeanette's face was pale, her eyes hollow, and Will kept rubbing his hands as though trying to scrub away the horror. By the time the officers finally left, and the crowd began to disperse, it was almost midnight. The Halloween festivities had come to an abrupt end. All that was left on the streets were bits of candy wrappers and the occasional crushed pumpkin. Nobody wanted to linger outside anymore. People left in small, somber groups, muttering to each other with haunted expressions. As for me, I felt numb. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pale hand emerging from that bag. The next day, news of the discovery spread like wildfire. I overheard bits and pieces at school, with some kids embellishing the story, adding gory details that hadn't even happened. Rumors circulated that it was the body of a homeless person, a victim of foul play, or even the result of some dark ritual. I didn't know what to believe, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Then, about a week later, we heard from Will. He'd stopped by our house to talk to my dad, and I happened to overhear their conversation. They identified the body. Will said in a low voice, barely above a whisper. It was a guy from a few towns over. Early 30s. Apparently, he took his own life. The weight of those words hit me hard. There was something tragic about knowing this person hadn't died at someone else's hands but had chosen to end their life. But even so, that didn't answer the question that had haunted me from the moment we'd discovered him. Why was he left here? Do they know how he ended up in your yard? My dad asked, sounding as baffled as the rest of us. Will shook his head, looking troubled. No clue. They think maybe someone moved the body, but they don't know who or why. They questioned a few people, but nothing's come up. The idea that someone had carried this poor man's body to our neighborhood, dumped it among Halloween decorations, and then left without a trace was chilling. Even though Will and Jeanette were well liked in the neighborhood, I couldn't help but wonder if someone had a grudge against them. They were known for their lavish house and decorations, their small taste of wealth in an otherwise modest town. Maybe someone, for reasons we couldn't understand, had wanted to shatter the peaceful illusion of their lives. Last Halloween, I was living alone for the first time in my grandmother's old house. She'd left it to me in her will, and although the house was a bit outdated and had its quirks, I adored it. I was 24, fresh into adulthood, and I wanted to make this place feel like a home. Plus, it was my grandmother's pride and joy, and living here somehow made me feel connected to her, even after her passing. I had spent weeks fixing up the yard, repainting the porch, and setting up the space to feel inviting. As Halloween approached, I figured a good way to get to know the neighbors was to hand out candy to the local trick-or-treaters. The day started off normal. I'd spent the afternoon carving pumpkins and setting out candles, and I even hung a few spider webs on the porch to keep things festive. As evening fell, the doorbell started to ring. Little ghosts and goblins, princesses and superheroes lined up at the door, eagerly holding out their bags for treats. Some of the adults recognized the house and started small talk, asking how long I'd lived here. When I mentioned it was my grandmother's home, their faces would soften, and they'd share stories or memories of her. It was a strange but comforting feeling, knowing that people had these warm memories of her. Around 9 p.m., the stream of trick-or-treaters began to thin out. I was thinking about closing up when I heard one last knock at the door. I figured it was just a few late kids, hoping for some extra candy before the night ended. But when I opened the door, there was just one person standing there, a man, tall and lanky, dressed in an old-fashioned purple suit. He was wearing a cheap, plastic mask that hid most of his face. The mask was blank, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. But what really got to me was the way he was standing. He held an empty pillowcase loosely at his side, swaying a little. He didn't look like he was part of the neighborhood crowd. "Trick or treat," he said in a strange, high-pitched voice that sounded like he was trying to mimic a child. I felt a chill run down my spine. The voice was unnatural, forced, and it didn't match his figure at all. He had to be at least in his 30s, yet he stood there, rocking from side to side, waiting expectantly for candy. Here you go," I muttered, dropping a small handful of chocolates into his pillowcase. His bag still hung low, too light, making me realize it was completely empty. Why was he even out trick-or-treating if he hadn't gone anywhere else? He didn't say anything as he took the candy, just stared at me through that cheap, creepy mask. I quickly closed the door, feeling relieved when I heard his footsteps retreating down the steps. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was probably some guy playing a prank, or maybe just trying to get in on the Halloween spirit a bit late. But something about him felt wrong, and even though I told myself to forget about it, I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see him standing there, staring back at me. The next night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat as I looked at the clock. It was almost 9 p.m., the same time as the night before. My mind immediately jumped back to the man in the purple suit, but I tried to brush off the thought. I wasn't in the mood for visitors, so I ignored it, hoping whoever it was would just leave. But the knock came again, louder this time. I glanced out the window and felt my stomach drop. There he was, standing on the porch in the same purple suit, holding his pillowcase and tilting his head as he waited. I couldn't see his face behind the mask, but I knew it was him. And then, in that same eerie, high-pitched voice, he called out, "Trick or treat!" I backed away from the door, trying not to panic. This time, I decided not to answer. I turned off the porch light and went to my bedroom, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But as I settled onto my bed, a loud thump echoed from my window. I froze, barely daring to breathe. Slowly, I turned my head to look, and there he was, standing right outside the window. He held up his empty pillowcase, shaking it a little, as if to say I hadn't given him enough. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought he might hear it. Swallowing my fear, I shouted, "Go away, or I'll call the police!" He didn't move. Just kept standing there, his face obscured by that eerie mask, looking straight at me through the glass. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, keeping my eyes locked on him the entire time. As soon as I started speaking to the dispatcher, he turned and walked back into the darkness, disappearing down the street just as the sound of sirens grew near. The police arrived quickly, and I explained the situation to them. They found him wandering a few blocks away, still in costume, and arrested him for trespassing and harassment. When they took off his mask, I saw him for the first time, a gaunt man in his 30s, with an unkempt beard and piercing, dark eyes that held no hint of remorse. He looked directly at me as they led him away, his expression a mix of anger and something else, something far more unsettling. That night I barely slept. For the next day or so, I tried to go about my routine, doing my best to shake off the experience. The police had assured me he'd stay in custody, but as they drove him away, something in his eyes had unsettled me deeply, a promise I couldn't quite put into words. I remember closing every blind, double-checking the locks, and feeling that uncomfortable itch of being watched even when I was completely alone. My relief was short-lived. Just 48 hours later, I got a call from the police informing me that they'd had to release him due to lack of any serious charges. Trespassing and harassment, they explained, only held up so long without any prior record of violence or threat. I hung up feeling sick. Every shadow outside my window seemed to hold his face, and I was starting to regret moving here alone. But I reassured myself, he wouldn't come back. Not so soon, at least. 2 nights later, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I heard something out back, a light, steady thump on the back door. It was subtle, almost hesitant, like someone testing if I'd notice. My stomach dropped, dread washing over me as I turned off the kitchen light and peered through the crack in the curtains. There he was, standing at the backyard door in his same creepy purple suit, mask back on, and holding that pillowcase. My breath caught in my throat as he cocked his head, staring directly at me. I couldn't see his eyes through the mask, but I knew he could see me. And then, with that horrible, too high voice, he began to chant, "Trick or treat, trick or treat." The sound was muffled through the glass but unmistakable. It felt like some twisted joke, but the icy look in his gaze told me it was anything but. I scrambled for my phone, feeling like I was in a nightmare as I dialed 911. As I spoke with the dispatcher, he didn't move. He just kept up his chant, louder now, calling out, "Trick or treat," over and over, waiting for me to respond. I was shaking, watching as he slowly backed away when he heard the sirens in the distance. This time, he didn't disappear into the night but waited on the street until the police arrived. When they arrested him, the officers seemed visibly frustrated. One of them approached me afterward and said, "Ma'am, we can take him in again, but I need you to understand that we can only hold him for so long without more evidence. Stalking laws are tricky, and right now he hasn't technically threatened you." I couldn't believe it. How was this not enough? I knew in my gut that something was deeply wrong with this man, that this was no ordinary harassment. I thanked the officers, but inside, I was beginning to feel hopeless. They took him away, but it felt like an empty gesture, a temporary fix to a problem that wouldn't go away. For the next week, I lived on edge. My heart would skip a beat at every creak or shadow, and I barely slept. The neighbors tried to comfort me, but even they couldn't fully understand. It wasn't just fear. It was this gnawing sense of being trapped, like I was caught in his sick little game, waiting for him to make his next move. One night, about a week after the second arrest, I woke up to the sound of something tapping against my window. The tapping was gentle at first, like someone tossing pebbles, but then it grew louder, insistent. I lay frozen in bed, praying it was just a stray branch in the wind. But then, from outside I heard it again. "Trick or treat." This time, his voice was quieter, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. I felt trapped, pinned in place as his words drifted through the glass, seeping into my bones. I couldn't bear it any longer. I shot out of bed, called the police again, and grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find. This time, he was nowhere to be seen when the police arrived, and after searching the area, they told me there was nothing more they could do. I sat on the couch after they left, staring at the darkened windows and feeling completely helpless. The officers had done all they could, but I felt like I was fighting a ghost, some kind of specter who could slip away just as easily as he appeared. It was like he was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. And I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how many times they took him away, he'd keep coming back. Days turned into weeks, and gradually, I started to relax. Halloween had passed, and without any more incidents, I convinced myself that he'd finally given up. I even resumed my normal routine, going back to work and seeing friends, though I was more cautious than before. But as the leaves began to fall and the air grew colder, that familiar sense of dread crept back in. October was nearing again, and with each passing day, I found myself anxiously counting down to Halloween. The night before Halloween, I couldn't sleep. Every small sound made my skin crawl, and I was hyper-aware of the silence outside, straining to catch any hint of footsteps or whispers. When dawn finally broke, I breathed a sigh of relief, convincing myself that the worst was behind me. Halloween came, and the day passed in a blur of unease. I decided to skip handing out candy that year. I left a bowl on the porch with a polite note, hoping to avoid any unwanted attention. As the night wore on, I felt myself gradually relaxing. Maybe it was over after all. Maybe he'd finally moved on. But as the clock struck midnight and I prepared to head to bed, a single, sharp knock echoed from my front door. I froze, heart pounding, a knot of fear twisting in my stomach. Slowly, I crept to the window, daring a glance outside. There, standing in the faint glow of the porch light, was an empty pillowcase. No one was holding it, no one was in sight, but it lay there as if placed just for me. I backed away from the window, heart racing, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, just a prank from the neighborhood kids. But deep down I knew. I could feel his presence lingering, watching. Even though I hadn't seen him for nearly a year, I knew he was still out there somewhere, waiting, lurking. And now, every Halloween, I find myself wondering if he'll return, if he's still out there, holding that empty pillowcase, waiting for the right moment to knock on my door and say, "Trick or treat." So here I am, another Halloween approaching, and I can't shake the feeling that he's close by. It's like he's a part of the shadows now, always just out of sight, waiting for the night to fall. And I can't help but wonder if one day, he'll finally step out from the darkness. Halloween that year was supposed to be special. I was finally allowed to trick or treat without my parents hovering nearby. My best friend, Matt, and I had been waiting for this moment for weeks, planning our route, debating who had the scariest costume, and dreaming about how late we'd stay out since it fell on a Saturday. We were 5th graders now, practically teenagers, or at least that's what it felt like. After some early trick or treating in our neighborhood and a quick dinner, we headed back out around 7:30. Most kids stuck to the main streets, with houses that handed out candy by the handful, front lawns lit up with ghosts and strobe lights. But Matt and I wanted something different, something darker, I guess. So we decided to explore a quieter street that led into the far side of our neighborhood, where houses were more spread out, and most kids didn't bother to go. The night was colder than I'd expected, and the streets felt eerily silent compared to the chaotic laughter and yelling on the main blocks. I remember shivering, partly from the chill and partly from the strange sense of quiet that wrapped around us as we went from door to door. It was as if we were the only ones on that street, our footsteps echoing as we crunched over dried leaves scattered on the sidewalk. After collecting candy from a couple of houses, we came to this one place that looked kind of different. The house was dark, not pitch black, but dim enough that it seemed like no one was home, except there was a faint glow coming from inside. Just as we started to turn away, the door flew open. A man stood there, watching us with an odd, stretched smile. He must have been in his mid-40s, bald, with a thin, awkward figure. He had this noticeable gap between his front teeth, and he was grinning way too hard. His clothes looked a little off for Halloween, not like a costume, but not like he was dressed normally either. "Happy Halloween!" he practically shouted. "Aren't you too scary tonight?" Thanks," I muttered, glancing at Matt. He looked as uncomfortable as I felt. But hey, free candy, right? So we both held out our bags. "Come on in," the man said, gesturing toward his living room. "I've got this spooky decoration, something you boys will love. A talking skeleton. It's trapped in a cage." He made this weird gesture with his hands, as if he were trying to mimic the skeleton. Matt and I just stood there, frozen. Everything about this felt off. Who invited kids into their house to see decorations? And honestly, the whole vibe he gave off was wrong. Something prickled at the back of my neck, telling me to just walk away. "No, thanks," Matt replied, shifting uncomfortably. We're just trick-or-treating." The man's smile dropped for a split second before returning, but it wasn't the same. It felt tense, stretched too thin across his face. "Oh, come on," he coaxed. "You won't be disappointed. And while you're in there, You can pick your candy yourself. Got some real good stuff for brave boys like you." He extended his arm, waving us in like he was leading us on some grand tour. "We're good, thanks," I said, taking a step back. Matt followed suit, clutching his bag. Finally, the man sighed and nodded, though he didn't look happy about it. He handed us each a piece of candy, a small, wrapped chewy thing in a clear wrapper, the kind that gets stuck in your teeth forever. I remember thinking it looked cheap, not the kind of candy people usually gave out on Halloween. But I stuffed it in my bag, too eager to move on. As we backed away, I noticed he was still standing in the doorway, watching us. He didn't close the door or even step back inside. He just watched us with that uncomfortable smile, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes following us until we were a good distance away. When I looked back over my shoulder, he'd stepped out onto his front porch, hands on his hips, like he was checking to see where we were going. Matt and I skipped the next house entirely. We were both too freaked out. When we got to the third house down, a lady answered the door, and we couldn't help ourselves. We told her what had happened, describing the strange man and his weird invitation. "Oh, him?" she said, frowning. "No, I don't know him. I'd tell your parents about that, though. It's probably nothing, but you never know." She was probably right. Maybe he was just lonely, or maybe he was one of those eccentric guys who didn't get that kids don't just wander into strangers' houses. We thanked her, took our candy, and started walking back toward the main street when we noticed two other kids around our age headed toward the creepy man's house. They looked familiar from school, but we hadn't seen them all night. They were dressed as pirates, laughing and talking loudly as they approached the front door. "Hey, did you guys just come from that weird guy's house?" Matt asked them, waving us over. They stopped, sharing a look before nodding. "Yeah, he was so weird," one of them said. "Tried to get us to go inside to see some Halloween thing he set up. We said no, but he kept pushing. Gave us these gross candies." The other kid pulled a piece of candy from his bag. Sure enough, it was the same see-through, chewy thing the man had given us. Matt and I exchanged a glance, and without saying a word, we both reached into our bags, found the candies, and threw them into the nearest trash can. The other kids did the same. "What do you think he wanted?" I asked, feeling a cold dread creeping over me. No one really knew, but we all agreed we weren't going to find out. The next day at school, everyone was buzzing about what happened. I figured it was just a scary story that kids were exaggerating. But then, around lunch, one of the teachers came in and announced something that made my stomach drop. Apparently, the man had been featured on the news that morning. Police were looking into several reports from kids who had all described similar interactions. He'd been reported for trying to lure kids into his house, not just with candy or Halloween decorations, but with all kinds of stories. Some kids said he claimed he had a new puppy in the backyard they could play with. Others said he'd offered to let them pick as much candy as they wanted from a giant bowl inside. The news confirmed what we'd all suspected but hadn't wanted to say out loud. This wasn't some innocent Halloween misunderstanding. The man was trying to get kids into his house, and he tailored his approach to each group, switching tactics depending on what he thought would work best. I was never so glad to have trusted that nagging feeling that something was wrong. And every Halloween since, I think about what could have happened if Matt and I had stepped inside that house. To this day, the memory still haunts me, his creepy grin, the way he just stood there watching, like he was waiting for us to make a mistake. It's a story that stuck with me, and I don't think I'll ever forget it.